Before he became one of the most famous writers of all time, Ernest Hemingway worked for the Kansas City Star. In his time as a reporter there, he learned how to compress every story down to its bare bones in a way that was both informative and compelling, while keeping other details below the surface. He would later apply this text versus subtext approach to his fiction and nonfiction writing, comparing it to an iceberg. In Death in the Afternoon, Hemingway wrote of his iceberg theory: "If a writer of prose knows enough of what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement in an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. The writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing." Hemingway understood that not everything needs to be spelled out for a story to be compelling, but the writer still needs to know the answers. It's easy to tell when a writer is being deliberately vague. We've all seen a TV show set up a whole bunch of questions that they don't know the answer to yet, and this almost always leads to clunky writing and awkward shortcuts in storytelling. Alternatively, we can all think of some great movies that leave us to answer the big questions on our own, but we know the writers have the answers in mind all along. It might seem odd to be talking about iceberg theory in relation to A Christmas Carol, but really think about how much of the story is left below the surface. Going solely on the text of the book and none of the adaptations, consider these questions. What exactly is Ebenezer Scrooge's job? Why did Scrooge's father reject him as a boy, only to change his mind later on? What exactly is Tiny Tim suffering from? If you think any of these questions are answered in the book, either an adaptation of the work has supplanted the original in your mind, or the original story is so vivid that your mind filled in the gaps with everything below the surface. Iceberg theory. A lot of adaptations of A Christmas Carol will try to answer some of these questions, and it goes without saying that some do it better than others. Today, we'll be looking at an adaptation that fills in a lot of Scrooge's backstory, and most viewers agree that the film is all the better for it. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Colin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Episode 3, Alastair Sim puts his stamp on Scrooge. As one of the most told and retold stories of all time, it's quite impressive that there is any version of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol that is considered in any way definitive. People have been adapting the story for 180 years, and yet there is one version that, more often than not, is considered the adaptation of A Christmas Carol. Sure, everyone has their favorites, and there are a few other versions from more recent years that have begun to challenge this one for the title, but they will have a hard time dethroning the 1951 film Scrooge with Alastair Sim. Just a quick note here, the film was originally called Scrooge, but some releases retitled it to A Christmas Carol. If it's from 1951 and it stars Alastair Sim, you've got the right film. So what is it about this film version specifically that makes it stand out among a field of adaptations? It wasn't the first theatrical version with sound, so it's not like it was the first of many. Admittedly, the 1935 version quickly faded into obscurity, but the 1938 one became a TV standard, so it's more than just being the first famous version. There are a few things unique to the 1951 Scrooge that elevate it to greatness. The script's expanded focus on Scrooge's past, the direction and cinematography, and Alastair Sim's performance as Ebenezer Scrooge. Despite its status, Scrooge is not a perfect film, and we will be getting to the flaws, which become more noticeable the more you watch the film. However, there are no big picture flaws here, like skipping Fezziwig, leaving out the charity workers, or leaving out the darker parts of the story. In fact, this version not only keeps the darker aspects of the story, but it expands on Scrooge's dark past in a way that feels organic and mostly true to the characters. The book has a fantastic contrast of darkness and light in its storytelling, and the film brings this out in a lot of ways, but primarily with the cinematography. Cinematographer C.M. Pennington Richards makes London by night look dark and shadowy, which only makes the mornings look more bright and welcoming. When we see Scrooge transported back to his school, it looks like a beautiful bright Christmas card with the white snow almost blinding our eyes. This version starts at the London Exchange, where we get to see Scrooge interacting with two men who will be talking about his death later in the Christmas Yet to Come sequence. One of these, British actor Peter Bull, also provides narration at the beginning and end of the film. We also see Scrooge interact with a man who owes him money on a loan. In just this brief scene, we see so much about what makes Sim's Scrooge work so well. He's not cartoonishly evil, and he does not derive pleasure from being a miser. Instead, he coldly tells the man that his time is up, and he will not grant him an extension despite the holiday. He is heartless about it, but he is also not needlessly cruel. This is in line with Dickens' description of Scrooge in the book, that Scrooge, for all his faults, was an honest businessman whose name was good for, quote, anything he chose to put his hand to. Scrooge has a similar exchange with the charity workers who are raising money for the poor. He seems exhausted by them more than anything, instead of being a mustache-twirling villain about it all.
If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, it's not my business.
Isn't it, sir?
No. It is enough for a man to understand his own business without interfering with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
There's an additional little scene we get that really helps show who Sim's Scrooge is. As he's eating dinner in a tavern, he demands the waiter bring more bread. However, when the waiter tells him it's just a halfpenny more, he changes his mind. It's a nice little moment that shows just how unhappy and cheap Scrooge really is. So many Scrooges from this era will do an old man voice of some kind, as we saw last week, often a Lionel Barrymore impression. Sim thankfully avoids this, finding the humanity in Scrooge instead of playing him as a caricature. And this is one of the primary reasons why he's the first great Scrooge on screen. He is sad and cold and lonely, and we see it all in Sim's face. He is also not afraid to show his outright fear at seeing the ghost of Jacob Marley, and that makes the scene all the more effective. Paired with the brilliant lighting, direction, and editing, Sim's performance gives us one of the best build-up to the entrance of Jacob Marley. When he actually does see the ghost, he is absolutely mortified, cowering in fear. A lot of the actors don't properly play up the fear here, but Sim's Scrooge is full child who just saw the monster under the bed, and it's brilliant. Now, the portrayal of Marley here is quite divisive. Michael Hordern plays the role, and some consider him one of the absolute best versions of the character, while others think the overacting goes way too far and it's silly. It is undeniably an over-the-top performance, with screaming, screeching, and crying all throughout.
It is a ponderous chain. Mark me! In life my spirit never roved beyond the limits of our money-changing home. Now I am doomed to wander without rest or peace. Incessant torture of remorse.
But it was only that you were a good man of business, Jacob.
Business! Mankind was my business.
On one hand, yes, it is a lot, and goes against the fairly subtle performances that most everyone else in this film is giving. It is distracting, and if it ruins the scene for someone, that totally makes sense. On the other hand, he's not going out of his way to scare Scrooge, but rather the over-the-top screaming comes from the emotional pain he's feeling. He can't help the people of the world, but he wants to. He regrets not being able to do it in his life, and now he's just heartbroken he can't. This version also gives us a scene of the wandering spirits trying to help mankind. And while the effects might be kind of cheesy, it's still an atmospheric scene, and I'm glad we get it, showing that there are hundreds of Marleys out there in the world. However, there is one thing that kind of brings it down a bit. In the forefront of the scene, you can see Mervyn Johns, who also plays Bob Cratchit, as one of the wandering spirits. Clearly, they were just doubling up some actors here, but why put one of the most prominent actors in the film on full display and let people be distracted? The Ghost of Christmas Past is played by Michael Dolan, and his appearance is simply that of an old man. Dolan's Christmas Past is fairly stoic, but there's kindness in him, and his voice provides the right amount of gravitas for these scenes. For the most part, he doesn't really hammer the lessons into Scrooge and lets Scrooge learn them himself, which is an important part of the character. Now, in terms of story, it's the Christmas Past sequence that really makes this adaptation stand out among the rest. The script was written by Noel Langley, best known for his work on The Wizard of Oz. In Dickens' A Christmas Carol, much of Scrooge's past is left to our imagination. The point of seeing him at school is that his childhood was challenging and his father was cruel. But as we meet people like Fezziwig and Belle, we learn that Scrooge was once a happy person who enjoyed Christmas and thought good of the world. We see a bit of his changed form in the breakup scene, but we see nothing specific in his evolution. We just see who he was and who he became. Here, we see how Scrooge goes from optimistic young man to old miser, and it is an extremely believable transformation. Young Scrooge is played by George Cole, an actor who was mentored by Sim and was basically a son to him. Now, I've always thought he really looked nothing like Alastair Sim, but I forgave the casting due to the performance and the real life connection. However, anyone who has seen pictures of Cole as an older man will acknowledge there is something of a resemblance after all. Cole does have a few lines that are a bit odd, such as telling a young fan,
"Same as I hardly know you now that you're quite a woman. Mamma must have looked as you look now just before she died."
or telling his fiancée.
"I love you because you're poor."
Besides those awkward lines, he does really well, and no one could save those lines. This version changes Scrooge's sister Fan from being his younger sister to being his older sister, and they do this so that Scrooge's mother dies in childbirth, and they can have the same thing happen to Fan with Fred. So we can see that Scrooge is cold towards Fred in the same way Scrooge's father was cold to him, because in both cases, someone died in childbirth, and the child who was alive is a living reminder. So Scrooge, in a way, has turned into his father. It's an interesting change from the book. I wish the movie didn't feel the need to have two different female characters pushed aside by dying in childbirth, but we do see Fan dying in this version, and it's more thematically connected to Scrooge's mother's death. Cole plays young Scrooge from his school days up through the breaking of his engagement with his fiancée, who is named Alice here instead of Belle. In addition to the scenes from the book, we also see Scrooge visiting Fan on her deathbed, where she asks him to look after Fred, but Scrooge is too caught up in his own thoughts of her getting better. While it could be argued this is not a necessary scene, it is still heartbreaking to see the modern Scrooge begging Fan for forgiveness, but knowing she cannot hear him. More interestingly, there is a subplot involving Scrooge's early business life. The book never tells us what exactly happened to Fezziwig, except that he died at an undisclosed date. Here, we see Scrooge leaving Fezziwig's for the more modern Mr. Jorkin, played wonderfully by character actor Jack Warner. Not to be confused with Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. This was a character actor who was actually on loan for a different studio. You can see in the opening credits that his actual production company gets a special thanks. Scrooge meets a young Jacob Marley, played by Patrick McNee, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Michael Horton. Great casting. Over the course of this subplot, we see Jorkin becoming successful in the Industrial Revolution, even buying out Fezziwigs. And Scrooge brings on his old co-worker Dick Wilkins for a lower salary than he had before. In a later scene, now with Sim and Horton playing Scrooge and Marley, we learn that Jorkin has been embezzling from the company. The other board members are aghast at this and want to prosecute him. But Scrooge and Marley offer to cover his losses in exchange for buying out the majority of the company. The film makes a really good choice in having these other board members look outdated and stuffy by giving them outlandish facial hair or large glasses. There are also a few acting choices that deserve special attention in this scene. Jack Warner played Jorkin in earlier scenes as a kind of future-focused man who might be a little wobbly morally, but is still pleasant and caring towards his employees. However, in this scene, it's clear that the man just does not care. When we transition into this scene, Jorkin has his elbow on the table, head on his hand like a bored child, as the members of the board read out his crimes. He is now dressed in a dapper striped jacket, and he is laughing at himself throughout the scene, knowing he'll never see trial.
Oh, but gentlemen, it could have been any one of you. We're all cutthroats under this fancy linen, Mr. Snedrig.
I must ask you to speak for yourself, Mr. Jorking.
What would you gauge to prosecute me? All you'd get out of it is about 11 pounds on. And to pack me off to Botany Bay would be poor compensation for the panic that would arise among the shareholders.
The other performance of note here is Horton as Marley. He says nothing throughout the whole scene, but he is so smug about the business proposition that he and Scrooge are making, and he has a great devilish smile throughout it all. I want to shout out the YouTuber Rambling Director who compared Marley in this scene to the person at a job interview who says nothing, but you know they're really in charge. I rank each adaptation on the adaptation meter, where I have 100 important events and descriptions from the book, and they get 1 point for each. I mention this now because this scene of Scrooge and Marley taking advantage of a bad situation to buy out the company has me split. One of my 100 adaptation points is Scrooge, for all his faults, is an honest businessman. This is an important aspect of the story because Dickens is calling out the evils of society as a whole. Scrooge can be, quote unquote, honest in his business practices and still be a heartless jerk who needs to change. And we see him being that kind of honest in the opening scenes of the movie where he seems to operate on a I don't care what time of year it is, I'm not putting any emotion into this, you owe me money. Now, the film makes it clear in these past scenes that Scrooge was not in on the embezzlement, and he does not agree with what has happened. He says so, and we have no reason to believe otherwise. But he still has no problem taking advantage of the situation. I like this subplot a lot, and I really do think it feels like Dickens. But I do have to dock half a point here on this count. It's not a deal breaker like the 1938's overly villainous Scrooge, but it is admittedly a little bit out of character. This version also shows us Jacob Marley's death, a scene that is crucial to the story but is almost never shown. Admittedly, the scene is not really in the book, as Dickens simply establishes at the beginning of the story that Marley is dead and Scrooge was the only person at the funeral. Still, film is a visual medium, so I appreciate the adaptations that try to include a version of the scene. Here, we see Scrooge working until closing time as Marley is dying, seemingly apathetic to his only friend on the last day of his life. Cratchit is working for them by this point, and he is clearly sad about Marley's death. We even see him asking Scrooge for the day off on Christmas, showing that this kind of thing happens every year. When Scrooge arrives at Jacob's home, there is a brilliantly chilling scene where we see an ominous-looking man at the top of the stairs. We soon learn this is the Undertaker trying to beat the competition and getting there before the guy dies. It's a darkly comedic moment that really works, especially because the Undertaker is played by the brilliant Ernest Thesiger, whom horror fans will know from The Bride of Frankenstein. On Marley's deathbed, Marley tries to communicate remorse to Scrooge, but all Scrooge can do is defend himself.
Wrong? Huh? Wrong. Oh. Well, we can't be right all the time. Nobody's perfect. We've been no worse than the next man. Or better if it comes to that. You mustn't reproach yourself, Jacob.
We're wrong.
The past expansion is really interesting here, and nothing feels forced or out of place. The downside of it is that the movie is only 85 minutes long, and once Christmas Past ends, we're at nearly 50 minutes in. Now, the present and future sequences are not exactly sped through like in the TV adaptations, but they end up feeling just a bit underwhelming. The ghosts, however, are not. Christmas Present is played by Francis DeWolf, who is considerably more mellow than most versions of this character. He could perhaps be a little more animated, but he captures the spirit of the book character pretty well. He also looks quite a bit like the character from the original illustrations, although he doesn't have the torch, and he does not have the empty sheath that Dickens described. Admittedly, the empty sheath, symbolizing peace, is one of those adaptation points that almost none of the versions will score. This Christmas Present also adds in a little diatribe about Christianity not from the book, telling Scrooge,
"We spirits of Christmas do not live only one day of our year. We live the whole 365. So is it true of the child born in Bethlehem. He does not live in men's hearts only one day of the year, but in all the days of the year. You have chosen not to seek him in your heart. Therefore you shall come with me and seek him in the hearts of men of goodwill."
Regardless of how you feel about this on-the-nose kind of speech, the more frustrating part about it is that it doesn't even make any sense, knowing what we know about this character. Christmas Present is a ghost who lives for just 24 hours, Christmas Day. He dies at the end of every Christmas. He's the ghost of Christmas Present. We see this happen in this version. Yet here, he says, we live the whole 365. You absolutely do not! Sure, keep Christmas spirit in your heart the whole year round is a wonderful message. But he really delivers it clunkily here. Alright, now let's talk about the religious angle. Is Dickens' tale a Christian one or a secular one? Well, it deals with a holiday that is both secular and religious. Throughout the centuries, Christmas has been celebrated by believers and non-believers alike. In fact, it was banned in early America by Christians because they worried it had grown too secular. The values expressed by A Christmas Carol's moral are values aligned with those Jesus preached in the Bible: charity, love, mercy, redemption, etc. Scrooge's change likely reads as a salvation of sorts, or even literally one for many Christians. That said, any major redemption in any work of fiction is likely to be compared to something that the reader or viewer is familiar with. For example, there have been essays written about the 1993 classic Groundhog Day that interpret it through the lens of Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, and many more. We tend to interpret it through what we know. Still, A Christmas Carol is explicitly about Christmas, so it seems a bit more logical to interpret it through a Christian lens. Ultimately, though, it doesn't really matter if the book is meant to be a metaphor for Christian redemption specifically or not. It doesn't hammer in a specific religious message outside of being good to your fellow human, which is basically one of the messages of any religious belief system. And Dickens would never have a religious diatribe like the one this film has. Interestingly enough, he does have a portion in Christmas Present where he criticizes churches for not helping the poor on Sunday, and this version leaves that out. Now, it's almost never adapted, and it's a bit odd as it sees Scrooge taking the side of the poor in the name of Dickens making an argument, but it does tie to Dickens' greater themes. The speech in the 1951 film is not particularly offensive or anything, but it's just clearly not written by Charles Dickens, which hurts it. Christmas Present starts by showing Scrooge a scene often not adapted, where miners underground stop their work to celebrate Christmas. These are miners who work underground, not underage children who also would be working during the Industrial Revolution. It is a bit of an odd scene on its own, without also showing the lighthouse keepers and sailors, but it is at least an attempt to adapt something else from the book, which adds to that feeling of people all around the country and all around the world celebrating Christmas. This is pure speculation on my part. I have no evidence for this, but it feels like there was supposed to be more here, maybe in the script or even more that was filmed, but it was cut for time at some stage to make room for more Christmas Past. Now, the scene of the Cratchit celebrating Christmas is one of those scenes that pretty much needs to be in every adaptation, but it is a scene that is hard to make entertaining. The Cratchit's general excitement about Christmas can be overplayed to the point of annoyance, coming off as overly sentimental, even insincere. The 1950s versions often fell into this, including things such as songs about Santa Claus or putting a star atop the tree. And in many of these, Bob Cratchit himself was something of a non-entity, just another member of his family celebrating Christmas. Thankfully, that is not the case here, as actor Mervyn Johns plays Cratchit as a humble and benevolent man who is aware of his situation. He's proud of his son Peter and the job he has lined up for him, and he adores Tiny Tim, feeling heartbroken that he might not get well. Tiny Tim can also be a hard character to pull off, as he's mostly just a plot device, but Glyn Dearman does quite well here. Many viewers might point out that he looks quite healthy overall, which is true, but Dearman's performance makes up for it just fine. Hermione Badley plays Mrs. Cratchit, and she also brings a lot to the role, feeling the weight of the family's situation, but trying to be cheerful for her family's Christmas. One weaker aspect of this adaptation is the portrayal of Scrooge's nephew Fred. This is a character who's supposed to radiate with the joy of Christmas, but actor Brian Worth's performance is quite understated. Sure, as I've mentioned, the performances in this film overall are quite understated, outside of Marley's ghost, and that works pretty well. But there needs to be some sign that this character is happy and joyful. He just comes off as bored and like he's going through the motions. There's an exchange in the book's Christmas present scene where Fred makes a comment in jest about his wife's dinner, but the way it's played here just makes it seem mean-spirited.
And what's the consequence? He's only cheated himself out of a highly indigestible dinner.
It was a wonderful dinner.
Yes, it was a wonderful dinner.
Well, I'm very glad you think so, miss, because I personally haven't very much faith in these newlywed housekeepers. Have you, Tupper?
Even when Scrooge reforms and goes to Fred's house on Christmas morning, it's really the performances of Sim and Teresa Darrington as Fred's maid that sell the scene, not Fred himself. One film original scene is added here as well, as the ghost shows Scrooge that his ex-fiancée Alice now works helping the poor on Christmas Day, making them quite happy. It's a lovely little scene showing that she truly was dedicated to making the world better. Now, the book has Christmas Past show that Scrooge's ex-fiancée Belle now has a large family, but we get no indication of her personal life in this film. I suppose a criticism could be made that this scene makes her look so saintly that she's not really a person, but I think it works even better than what we get in the book. For one, all of the book's other Christmas Past scenes have Scrooge in them, but the scene of Belle and her family only has a mention of him. Showing where she is at Christmas today instead hammers the message home quite well. Instead of saying, here's what you could have had, This one says, "She left you because you love money too much, and she's dedicated her life to helping those who have no money." This is the first version I've talked about to include one of the most unsettling scenes from the book: the children, ignorance, and want. Before the ghost of Christmas Present departs, he opens up his robe to reveal the two ghastly children and warns Scrooge to beware of them. When Scrooge asks if they have anywhere to go, Christmas Present repeats Scrooge's words back to him once more: "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" Now, early in the book, we saw Scrooge refuse to help those less fortunate by turning down charity workers, but they still served as a barrier between Scrooge and the poverty he refuses to look at. Here, Scrooge is shown that his ignorance towards the less fortunate and his want for more gain are monsters who will destroy him. The scene in the 1951 film is fairly underwhelming, as the children just kind of sit there and don't look too ghastly. They look a little underfed, but at least we get the scene. While it's not surprising that this was left out of the musical versions or shorter versions, it's a crucial scene in the book, and it nicely transitions into the darkness of Christmas yet to come. The introduction of the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come in this version is highly atmospheric. After Christmas Present disappears, Scrooge begins to run, only to come face to face with the new spirit. We don't see what Scrooge is looking at outside of a hand, but we can see that he is mortified. When we do finally see the ghost, it looks just like the book's description, clad in a black robe with only the hand visible. The blasting music from Richard Addinsell's score is the cherry on top of this scene. Reviews at the time mentioned this movie might be scary for young kids, and you can see why with this scene. It's actually surprising that director Brian Desmond Hurst and cinematographer C.M. Pennington Richards never did much work in the horror genre, because this film owes a considerable debt to it, and I think this scene is the best example. However, outside of this opening, the yet to come scenes don't quite get it right. The ghost starts by showing Scrooge the morning Cratchits, which doesn't really make sense. Scrooge has already been told Tiny Tim will die. Christmas Present tells him that in the book and pretty much every version, including here. He's only shown this scene in the book when he asks to see tenderness connected with death. Of course, he's hoping it'll be his own death, but he doesn't ask it literally, and he gets shown tenderness connected to someone else's death. It's kind of like when you don't ask a genie for a specific enough wish. After we see the Cratchits in this version, who are played very well, again, Mervyn Johns, really good, we see the people bartering his things, which hits harder here because we've already met Mrs. Dilber and the Undertaker in previous scenes. This is followed by Scrooge seeing two men at the exchange discussing his death, again, characters we've already met. The movie does a really good job of this, of setting up all of these characters we go on to see, so it hits a little harder. Now, the ordering of the scenes is what's confusing here. They were probably ordered this way to build up the tension, as it's pretty easy to guess Scrooge is the dead man right away in the book. Still, the point of the book is that he will die alone and no one will care. It's not like it's meant to just be a twist that he died. That's not surprising to anyone. Thankfully, the graveyard scene is done beautifully. The spirit makes Scrooge walk a long way to his grave, and once he has, he is still begging the spirit to confirm that things can change.
Are these the shadows of things that must be? Or are the only shadows of things that might be? I know that men's deeds foreshadow certain ends, but if the deeds be departed from, surely the ends will change.
He, of course, gets no answer. Sim is brilliant here, begging for logical answers instead of dealing with the emotion of seeing his own grave, which is so in character. He's been a very logical person the whole time. Even in this, he knows that he's about to be overwhelmed with emotion, but he wants those logical answers. Really good stuff. When he does see his name on the grave, he lets out an unearthly scream and falls onto the grave, worried that he's already died. He never goes too over the top with it, even though he is desperately begging for another chance. This scene in particular is one of the reasons why he is one of the greatest Scrooges. One of the best things about Alastair Sim in this role is that he is never afraid to look ridiculous. When he's afraid of a ghost, he goes all in on the fear. When he's begging for a second chance, he is crawling on his grave. When he is redeemed on Christmas morning, he dances around like a child. Despite knowing how Mrs. Dilber would sell his things in one version of the future, he still treats her wonderfully and gives her a raise. She, quite understandably, thinks he's lost it. The Christmas morning scenes get cut a little bit short here, as we don't see Scrooge donating to the charity workers or talking to the poulterer, but we see a good bit of Scrooge's genuine joy. The scene at his counting house the next day is also done perfectly. Scrooge can barely put up a facade of meanness because he's so happy. After pulling one over on Bob, he begins to laugh uncontrollably, and then says very genuinely,
I haven't taken leave of my senses, Bob. I've come to them. From now on, I want to try to help you to raise that family of yours. If you'll let me.
After Bob leaves to get another coal scuttle, Scrooge says, I don't deserve to be so happy. We also get a nice little epilogue confirming that Tiny Tim got well and also considers Scrooge to be his uncle now. This is truly a beautiful adaptation of the story. There are undeniably flaws, like Fred, the order of Christmas yet to come, and a few of the lines, but the strengths greatly overpower them. It balances the darkness and light of the original story wonderfully, and the ending feels earned. Still, this was not exactly a hit when it came out. It did well in the UK, but not in the US, and reviews were all over the board. Bosley Crowther praised it for its lack of artificial gloss, saying, quote, the usual conceptions of Christmas in terms of puddings and flowing bowls are not visualized in this picture to any conspicuous degree. He doesn't name the Reginald Owen film from 1938 in his review, but it's clear that's the one he's comparing it to. One interesting thing about multiple reviews is the criticism of the film's style, which to me is one of its great strengths. It seems that a lot of reviewers thought it was just too dour. It eventually became a TV favorite in both the US and the UK. Although it is interesting to note that the Times obituary for Brian Desmond Hurst called Dangerous Moonlight his most popular film, not Scrooge, and that was in the late 1980s when he died. So even since then, it's become a classic. Regardless, every version of A Christmas Carol released since 1951 will inevitably be compared to this one, and the filmmakers know this as they're making the film. There are also multiple people from this production who would go on to other versions of A Christmas Carol, and we'll talk about all of them in the future. Sim and Horden would reprise their roles in a 1971 animated version of the tale, and Horden would do a Basil Rathbone and go from Marley to Scrooge in a live-action British TV version in 1977. Additionally, editor Clive Donner would go on to direct the 1984 version of A Christmas Carol starring George C. Scott. Let's take a look at where this one falls on the Christmas Carol adaptation meter. Scrooge 1951 scores an impressive 64.5 out of 100, which is the highest score so far. The things it leaves out are mostly minor things, although it would be nice to see Scrooge donate to the charity workers at the end, or if we got the Christmas yet to come scenes in a deliberate rhythm. We do get some nice parts that many adaptations from around this time would leave out, like the miners and ignorance and want. Overall, this is a remarkably faithful adaptation of the novel's mood and themes. The added scenes feel in line with what Dickens wrote, and the film doesn't leave out the message of caring for the poor. So, is this the best film version of the story, and is Sim the best Ebenezer Scrooge? When it comes to Sim, there is absolutely nothing wrong with his performance. There are no flaws to point out, really even minor ones. So it'll entirely come down to personal preference. He clearly understands this character, his past, and his motivations, and he plays Scrooge to a T. As for the adaptation, it is really good, but I do think the flaws are big enough that I can make a convincing argument towards at least one other version being better. Still, it has retained its classic status for a reason, and it is one of the best. Next time we go back to TV, and we'll be entering the golden age of TV Christmas specials, talking about 3 different TV versions from the 1960s. Stay tuned for some more personal thoughts on this version, and thank you for listening to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. All right, so that is the 1951 film Scrooge. It is really the first iconic film or TV adaptation of the story, and it remains very possibly the most iconic. So I wanted to give it its own episode. There is a lot to say about it and the way it adapts the story. And there is so much this movie does really well, even when you've watched it multiple times. This is one of those that I find myself watching pretty much every year just because the strengths are so good, particularly in those past scenes, which are really, really effective. I think the subplot about Scrooge's gradual hardening of heart as he gets worse and worse is a really good expansion on what's already in the book. When Belle tells him, you've changed, you've fallen in love with money too much, which that is an answer as to why he's changed. He's fallen in love with money, but what made him fall in love with money? And in this, we see some of it is there's a changing world, and the Industrial Revolution is changing the way business is done for everybody. And at first, we see Scrooge in this version is actually quite worried about that. He says the world's getting darker, and that worries him. But as he grows and gets older in this version, he becomes a part of the system himself, which is all too often the story. And that's why Alice in this version, she's called Alice. That's why Alice leaves him in this version, is because he's become part of the system he was hoping to destroy. And it's really tragic. It's not just, oh, look how greedy he is. He's become a part of the system he hated so much. We get more of Marley in this version too, and Marley seems more on board with this whole Industrial Revolution thing from the beginning. He's more on Mr. Jorkin's side, and Scrooge has to kind of gradually devolve into it. Marley is one of those characters where we get so little of him in the book that he's that tip of the iceberg character. We have to fill in our own blanks of who exactly was Marley. Was he an equal to Scrooge? Well, they were both in the partnership together. But was he a mentor? Was he a younger man? It's entirely up to the interpretation of the reader and how the adaptation chooses to make it. In this case, they're both proteges of Mr. Jorkin, and I think that works really well. Now, it's interesting because Michael Horden, who plays Marley here, he was only, I think, 39, but he looks just as old as Alastair Sim, which is interesting because, that's not too much older than the actor who was playing quote unquote young Marley. Yeah, he had quite a career ahead of him. He was a really good character actor, Michael Horden. If you've heard the 1980s BBC Lord of the Rings for radio, which for many fans, again, is the definitive take on that story, Michael Horden plays Gandalf in that, and he has a really good voice for it. Great performance. And like I said, he plays Scrooge in an upcoming version we'll talk about. He's really good here, particularly in the scene where he doesn't even say anything. You just see that smirk on his face. He's so happy with the deal that's being made and how they're buying out the company. We really get the impression, and this gives Scrooge a bit of an out for the whole morals thing of being a quote unquote honest businessman, because we get the impression, even with Marley saying no words there, that it was Marley's decision to buy out the company and cover up for Mr. Jorkin instead of prosecuting him because of how bad it would make the company look. So I give Scrooge a half point on that adaptation meter because, yeah, he's not an honest businessman in that moment, but it might be his worst moment. So he's not doing anything completely illegal either. He's doing something that was probably fairly common when people were stealing from a company. And I think it's a subplot that works. So I'm glad it exists, even if it means kind of going around that one point from the book. And I believe the name Mr. Jorkin, even internet people are going to probably laugh about that one today. It was taken from a character called Mr. Jorkins in David Copperfield. I mentioned a bit with Jack Warner that he was on loan from another studio. For those not familiar with how filmmaking worked in the 30s, 40s, even 50s, like this film, you were signing a contract with one studio, and that studio was where you would make all your films unless they could loan you out to somebody else. So before actors were independent agents, they were working for one studio. So like if you signed with MGM, you'd be only doing MGM movies for 7 years. So that's why there's that special thanks in the opening credits to a different studio for letting them borrow Jack Warner for this. Talked a bit about George Cole, who plays young Scrooge in the past scene. Sim and his wife would train young actors and take them into their homes, and George Cole was, like I said, basically a son to him, which is how much he lived in their house from teenage years on. And even after Sim died, I believe Cole lived next door or very close to Sim's wife, Naomi. Just very, very close relationship there. Uh, and Sim was a very private actor, didn't really like interviews or press tours or anything else, but he cared about training up younger actors, and obviously Cole learned a lot from him. So That's why he plays the part here. I mean, obviously, also because he's a good actor. He's very good in the role. Wish a few of those lines had been tweaked, like, "You must look like Mother did before she died." And by showing all these extra scenes in the past that we know happened, not the work subplot, but Marley's death and Fan's death, it really does serve to show just what a tragic life Scrooge has had. It's always under the surface in the other versions, again, because we know Fan is dead. We know he lost Marley 7 years ago and is still obviously thinking of Marley even when he tries to deny it. Again, I think some versions miss that Marley was his friend, and we get that here. He can't come to terms with his emotions connected to Marley's death, and we see that here when Marley's dying and Scrooge is spending the whole time defending their business practices, saying, "Oh, we're no worse than the other man," while Marley is basically saying he did something wrong, which sets up that Marley will have regret when he comes back as a ghost. And now he has to work towards helping Scrooge to get better. So that's a really good setup. And again, Michael Horton, really, really good in that scene. Really convincing as Marley. The ghost scene, he kind of looks like a sad clown at times throughout it. I wish they could have downplayed the expressions just a little bit, but his cries of pain are authentic. It's a really emotional performance. It's over the top. For my personal taste, yeah, it's a little bit much when he's just as a ghost, but it's still not out of character. It's not how some of the other versions play it, where it's just trying to scare Scrooge. It's all very much correct to the character. It just could have been played a little bit differently, but that's so much of this version. It comes down to personal preference. But Michael Horton clearly is giving a committed performance throughout this film, and he gets some really, really good moments. One other actor to talk about here who is interesting is Teresa Darrington, plays the maid at Fred's house. She has an internet following that can't really be overstated. Keep an eye on my social media because I'm going to post the link to this blog where this was all uncovered. She only has that one scene when Scrooge goes to Fred's house. He says, "Is Fred here?" But I think because she's so innocent and sweet looking in that scene, and I think a lot of people think she looks like Audrey Hepburn, which is probably another reason, that people just really connect to her in just a few seconds of screen time. I mean, I don't really get it. No offense. She's good. It's in the scene. She's very good. But it's not like anything that I can believe the whole blog posts have been written about people trying to find who that actress is because they like her so much. But yeah, they did these deep dives and they tracked her down somehow. She wasn't even credited in the movie, but they tracked her down because one of her relatives saw the post and they asked her some questions about it. Apparently, she said most of the cast was really nice that she worked with. Alastair Sim was not in a good mood on that day. She only probably worked with him one day. But yeah, she basically said he seemed to be kind of mocking whether it was the first movie she ever worked on and it was actually her second. She retired from movie making after this, but it's really iconic for a lot of people. So hey, it's a well played moment. It's fascinating that such a small scene with a character who's on screen for seconds developed this whole online following. And not like ironically, it's not like Star Wars characters who flash by people like to joke about, oh, that's E.T.'s brother or whoever. Genuinely, they just liked the performance that much. They wanted to know who the actress was. And that's one of the great things about the internet. Like this actress who probably never thought about this movie beyond just, oh, I worked in movies very briefly. She had a whole moment where she discovered people loved seeing her scene and they really loved her performance. So I think it's great. That's really cool. They tracked her down and she got to talk about that a little bit. One other interesting connection in this movie. So we have in the Cratchit home, Hermione Badley. You will probably know if you've seen Mary Poppins. She plays Ellen, the maid, the only one who gets any work done around there. She is in this as Mrs. Cratchit, and Bob Cratchit is played by Mervyn Johns. Now his daughter was Glynis Johns, who plays Mrs. Banks in Mary Poppins. It goes farther if you want to bring in other Christmas Carol adaptations we've talked about, because Reginald Owen, who played Scrooge in the 1938 A Christmas Carol, plays Admiral Boom in Mary Poppins, and two-time Mrs. Cratchit, Queenie Leonard, even has an uncredited role in Mary Poppins. So a lot of overlap between A Christmas Carol and Mary Poppins here. I mentioned Peter Bull, the actor who plays the narrator in this and one of the businessmen. He's probably best known these days as the hilarious Russian ambassador in Doctor Strangelove. But yeah, he's quite good here. He's very noticeable screen presence, very big guy, very big voice. The director of this, Brian Desmond Hurst, There are documentaries about him. He's kind of thought of as like an underrated, sort of forgotten director of this era of British film. From what I can tell, he seemed to be openly gay at a time when that was not very popular. Yeah, he had a really interesting career. He was a protege of John Ford and then moved back to the UK, did some propaganda films during the war, and then went on to make all kinds of films, dramas and comedies, and this. This is, of course, his most famous film today, and understandably, because as with any Christmas film that's even somewhat of a classic, it gets played every year. Even if you make other films that are well received at the time, as he did, he had plenty of hits. If you have a Christmas classic, you're going to get it every year, and that's the one people are going to talk about. So it's become his most well known film, and understandably so. And like I said, Noel Langley, who wrote this screenplay, was one of the screenplay writers for the classic The Wizard of Oz. I'm not sure how much of his script got into the final script. There were so many rewrites of that film. That's a whole rabbit hole if you want to go down that about the production of the 1939 Wizard of Oz just from the screenplay side. It was rewritten so many times, and during production and things were cut, it was a mess. It's amazing that anything even came out of that film, let alone not even that it's one of the greatest films of all time, just that anything good came out of that with how messy it was. It's kind of like Apocalypse Now, just the messiest possible film production, and it turned out one of the most acclaimed films of all time. Christmas Past here, he's like an old man with long gray hair, which is, to be fair, kind of like part of the book's description of him. Again, the book's description is constantly moving, constantly changing. He's like an old man and he's like a child. So they keep the old man part. I always wondered if they wanted him to be like Father Time in this. He has long hair. He doesn't have a beard, but he has the long white hair. And the transitions between all the past scenes are like this cave with an hourglass turning over. So I think they're kind of going for a Father Time thing here. I don't mind this take on the ghost. I think it's a little underwhelming, but not in a bad way. He does fine, and he stands back as Scrooge learns the lessons on his own. I know the part in Christmas Present where I say it's not a specific religious text might disagree with some people, and that's fine. I know for a lot of people this is a very, very religious story. I've kind of even switched back and forth on how I feel about this story and its religious themes. But for the most part, I think it's a general be good to your fellow man kind of story more than specifically Christian, even though it does take place at Christmas. Marley does mention he wished he'd followed the star that the wise men did. I think that could be made as an argument for being a story of Christian redemption. But beyond that, it's mostly just a redemption story as a whole, and you can interpret it however you like. I don't care for that scene where Christmas Present just goes on that you need to see Christ in your heart. It's just so on the nose, and it does not feel like Dickens in the slightest. So, regardless of your feelings towards the religiosity of the story, that moment is just, it's not well done. And I do like this Ghost of Christmas Present. He gets a little bit cut short for time, but he has a really good look. He looks like the character from the book. Great voice, great appearance. So yeah, I just don't like that one speech. And it's a little bit downplayed, but I get it. It fits the story. The Christmas yet to come build up is just perfect. It's just perfect when he runs and sees that ghost, and before we see anything, we know he's looking at something terrifying. Less is more. It's great. That, Jaws thing if you don't see the monster. So I mentioned really it comes down to personal preference about whether Alastair Sim is the best Scrooge. I can't point out anything that's a flaw. He is really, really good. I think there are some performances here that either aren't great or haven't aged well. It's very much a 1950s movie, but Alastair Sim, it still holds up. It's still a really good performance. It's not quite my favorite. In terms of whether this is the best version, I think I can give definitive arguments as to why another version is better. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. But as for why I prefer another Scrooge over Sim, it's just I think another actor makes some decisions that are a little bit more specific and a little bit more meaningful than what Sim does throughout. A slightly different take on the character, and it's kind of building on Sim to be fair. But it's just a slightly different take on the character where I think one actor at least does it even better. And that's no slight to Sim, who is really, really good. We'll talk about that more when we get to it. There are usually about 3 versions that are talked about as the best version of all time. This is always on the list. It's usually the top. In recent years, the Muppet version seems to be number 2. A lot of people say that's the most faithful version. A lot of people say Michael Caine is the best Scrooge. Even though it's the Muppets, I will say it's very faithful. A lot of people think it's the best version. And the third one that's kind of a wild card Some people's favorite is the George C. Scott one from 1984. So those are the three that are usually in contention when we're talking about the best versions. Everyone's going to have their favorites. I know some people really like the Patrick Stewart one as well. But those are the three that usually are in the discussion. I'm not going to talk too much about those till we get them, but just for those interested, when I talk about this as the definitive version, and I still do think this is considered the definitive version by most people. So that might change in, 20, 30 years, who knows? But for now, this seems to be the version people talk about the most as the definitive. And yeah, I wanted to talk about the Hemingway tip of the iceberg stuff because I think people forget just how ambiguous so much of A Christmas Carol is. In some cases, adaptations seem to agree. I have not seen too many versions that make Scrooge's father an actual character that then portray him sympathetically. Scrooge's father's not actually in this one, by the way, but a lot of versions will add him as a character, and if he's going to get added as a character, he's going to come off as even worse than in the book. There might be versions I haven't seen where he actually is nicer. Well, the book says, in fans' words, that father's nicer than he used to be. We don't know what brought about this change, but he's nicer than he used to be. There are other versions that keep this line, and then we learn that he is absolutely not nicer than he used to be, and he's just as cruel. There is a recent version where he is just the absolute worst version of this character. There are other versions that also do. Scrooge's father doesn't like him because Scrooge's mother died in childbirth, and then the implication being Fan also died in childbirth, and that's why Scrooge doesn't like Fred. And this is the first version that does anything like that. So in the book, we see that things were tough for Scrooge at school, but now that his father's better, things are turning around for him, which transitions nicely into Fezziwig's, because Fezziwig is a really great person, really great boss, and things are really good for Scrooge. So the movies that have Scrooge's father still be a jerk, they make the transition to Fezziwig's much different, where Fezziwig is like the first good adult figure he's had in his life, which is a much more interesting way to look at it. I think it's a fine change. It doesn't bother me one way or the other, because the only thing we hear about Scrooge's father having changed is from Fan, who's a little girl. She could be wrong about him, so I think it leaves enough open. And again, that tip of the iceberg thing. There's so many questions that are intentionally left unanswered, and I think that's for the better. And the adaptations can handle them in their own way, and a lot of them do it very interestingly. Somehow you haven't seen this version, do check it out. It's a classic for a reason. I honestly don't know the first time I saw this one. I remember the first time specifically sitting down and watching this, and that was actually for my blog project about a decade ago. But there were parts that felt familiar, so I had probably seen at least part of it on television before when I was young, and it just kind of was added to the list of many, many versions I watched as a kid. For a while, I had thought the 1938 was the version everyone thought was the best. I mentioned this a bit in my first episode. So when I actually sat down and watched this version, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I see why people think this is the definitive version. It's a really well-told story. It's got a great Scrooge, and a lot of it really, really works. And unlike so many other versions, it's clear that the screenwriter read and understood the novel, which is really, really important in any adaptation, obviously. But so many versions of A Christmas Carol, it feels like they either haven't read it or they haven't read it in a long time. The 49 version is one example of that. So in this version, clearly the writer and director and the lead actor all understood the novel and its characters, and it's all the stronger for that. So yeah, that's Scrooge 1951. It's going to come up a lot more, of course, because it is the version that so many other versions draw from. And yeah, over time, it just became the version in so many people's minds. Sim would play the role again. I'm very excited to talk about his second time playing the role because that's a really interesting version, too, the Richard Williams animated one. Next week, we are going to be talking about the 1960s and two very different adaptations of A Christmas Carol, plus a third one that's just also there. So we got Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol and Rod Serling's Carol for Another Christmas. These are very, very different takes on the story, and I'm very excited to talk about these because I know I have some listeners who are fans of Mr. Magoo, and I'm sure there's Rod Serling fans out there, maybe some who don't even know Carol for Another Christmas. These are not hard to find versions. You can find them. Seek them out if you haven't, because they are interesting. I'm not going to say more about them right now, but we'll talk about those next week, in addition to an Australian animated version from 1969 that I have to include somewhere. So I'm going to talk about that with those other two, but it's not really related to Rod Serling or Mr. Magoo. It's just a third adaptation. That's next week. Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast is written, edited, and hosted by Colin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by T.R.G. Banks, and T.R.G. Banks' Snowfall is used for interstitial music as well. Clips in this episode are from Scrooge, 1951. The Hemingway iceberg theory quote is from Death in the Afternoon, and the Bosley Crowther review comes from the New York Times Archive. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. I'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.